So I was watching this video by Johnny Harris, which talked about the blockade that the US is setting up from Japan all the way down to the Philippines, including Australia. And it got me thinking about a potential World War III. If China decides to invade Taiwan and Japan has to back them, now Japan is allied with the United States in World War III. So how would Japan fare during World War III? Will it be an incredible adventure or the worst thing to happen to them? What's going to happen to their economy? What's going to happen to their people? Let's get into it. First, let's start with Japan's unique position in the East Asian geopolitical landscape. Japan has to maintain a balance between its alliance with the US and its economic interest in China. Japan makes a whole bunch of money from China, both from tourism and other areas, but it needs to be aligned with the US because after World War II, the US nuked the crap out of Japan and basically bought their allegiance for the next several hundred years or more. So Japan needs to ally with the US regardless of how strong China is. This isn't good and typically would be a very bad thing, but Japan also has a pacifist constitution, which means that it can't have a military. This has been changed a little bit recently, but Japan is pacifist, which keeps them out of a lot of this fighting. China's not worried about Japan bombing them, for instance. But when the US comes in and starts placing military bases all along Japan's islands, that doesn't sound very pacifist to me. It's not like Japan would allow China to do the same thing and build military bases next to the US bases. No, Japan is very US-centric as a military ally. The problem is Japan might be in a no-win scenario where, let's say China is the best person to ally with, but they're stuck as allies with the United States. Who knows if they would be able to flip-flop and join the obvious ally that they should be with, China, in this scenario. So let's say they are allied with the US, they're stuck allied with the US. What happens during World War III? We'll start with the economic impact. There's going to be a trade disruption, which is a slowdown of imports and exports because of the disputed trade routes. Companies like the automotive industry and the technology industry that heavily rely on both Chinese and American markets are going to stall out. These are big parts of Japan's GDP, which is going to cause inflation in the country, and it's going to cause a huge economic issue. That's going to lead to a ton of market volatility, which is a potential sharp sell-off in equity markets, which will lead to lower asset values and second-order wealth effects. Basically, the Japan economy is going to crash harder than Elon Musk's first few SpaceX rockets. There's also going to be increased demand for safe haven assets like government bonds and gold, which will lead to lower yields on these assets. That's going to lead to the Bank of Japan having a ton of problems maintaining financial stability. Not good for the Japanese economy, which has already been plateauing since 1995. This is also going to impact multinational corporations who are going to have difficulty in managing operations for companies with a significant presence in both China and the US. This is going to be horrible for companies like Toyota and Sony, which sell to both countries. This will lead to possible job losses if companies are forced to scale back operations due to declining revenues. Japan is at war with China, so why would China allow them to sell Toyota cars? They're just going to take all the plants and all the technology. This is going to be bad for Toyota, who's leveraged in China and now has a bunch of debt that they can't pay back. This also goes for all the US companies, by the way. Those Starbuckses that are in China are also going to be taken by the Chinese if there's a war. Then there's the geopolitical impact. There's going to be a huge security dilemma. The risk of military confrontation if Japan supports the US militarily. Japan is very close to China, way closer than the US is to China. So if China was going to nuke anybody, say, it'd be a lot easier for them to nuke Japan or maybe South Korea than it would to be sending nukes over to the United States, and it would be a lot less likely to cause a nuclear Armageddon. So if China wants to show their force and use nuclear bombs, they're more likely to nuke Tokyo than they are to nuke New York. That's not to mention all of the other backlash that Japan might face if it backs out of its pacifist agenda. Now they're really aligned with the US and they're going to lose support of the entire other half of the world. This is a world war, meaning, let's say it's China and Russia and maybe some other countries against the US and Japan and those other countries. Japan might lose half its economy overnight. This all depends on how strong China is, because there are all the other ASEAN countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Laos, Thailand, even Philippines, which if they're not allied with the US are going to side with China and stop doing business with Japan. It might also lead to complications within forums like the UN, where Japan's stance could impact its relationships with other member nations. In this case, the US owns the UN. We started it, it's in New York, so Japan's most likely going to be safe, but will China be removed from the UN if there's a World War III? Will the UN be dissolved? Who knows? Speaking of nukes, Japan does not have nukes. It's a Western country that has never developed or acquired its own nuclear weapons, and so the US is going to be at a crossroads. Australia does have nukes, and they're most likely going to be on the US's side, but does the United States give Japan nuclear weapons, the one country that they've nuked in the past? And will giving Japan nuclear weapons lead to them flipping sides and going against the US? These are all things to think about. Then there's the social impact. The population is going to be displaced. If the US goes to war with China, people in Japan that can leave are going to leave. The Japanese get easy visas into the United States. They're going to be leaving into the US. They're going to be leaving however they can. Maybe they're going to go to India. They're going to get away from this area as fast as they can. There's also going to be huge protests internally. Even though Japan is allied with the United States, Japan is a pacifist nation. It's got a strong culture of peace. So there's going to be a ton of protests inside the country, and the government is going to feel pressure to either remove the US or remove China as allies. They're going to feel pressure to do something, which is going to lead to a shift in the political landscape, with potential power shifts toward either those advocating for a tougher military stance or those advocating for more peace and more neutrality, if that's even possible. So what is the mitigation strategy? They can develop alternative trade partnerships to reduce the dependence on the US and China. Japan has to see the problematic spot that they're in. US might go to war with China, and if they do, they're going to lose half of their economy either way. So they need more partners that they're not going to lose in this scenario. They also need to promote innovation and new industries for future economic stability, which is bad for Japan, which again has been plateauing for the last 10 years or more. They also might try to do a peace deal between US and China. As you guys know now, Japan is in a horrible spot. Maybe they're going to try to broker peace between US and China, have them both into Japan, have them shake hands, and maybe Japan is responsible for stopping World War III. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could happen. Japan is at major risk of getting decimated in World War III. Regardless of what happens, Japan is not in a good spot. If the peace deal they try to broker in this scenario fails, they're in a bad spot. If the war starts, they're in a bad spot. If they get nuked, they're in a bad spot. If the US gives them nukes, now they're allied against the US and might also be in a bad spot. Japan is in a no-win situation here that they got themselves into after World War II that we're just now seeing the ramifications of. This speaks a lot to the long-term effects. There are some decisions that you're making now that you might not know are going to come back to bite you in 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. This might be relevant to your personal life, and I'm learning a lot just from watching Japan. You make a horrible deal in the past, guess what? You might think it's great for decade after decade, and then a war comes, and you lose everything. What do you think about the situation? Let me know down below, subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. I'm Alex Berman.